Hi and welcome to the channel. Today I want to walk you through an experiment, a patch that I designed to serve as a base for other sounds. And probably know from the title of this video, I went into an adventure to try to model a violin into the Hydrasynth. To be very honest with you, my first goal was actually to model an erhu instrument, but I'm not completely happy with my results. But what I realized is that while trying to do that string instrument, I ended up with a pretty solid bass patch that can serve as a bass for a cello, or if you go an octave above, a sound of a violin. And maybe you can use this as a base to have a whole strings ensemble. Without further ado, let me walk you through all the steps to recreate this patch if you're interested. I think the first menu that we should have a look into is the voice menu, and the main point here is to leave your polyphony into poly mode, and I've also used the random phase on to let this sound to be more organic. And here on page 2 I also got rid of the default vibrato on the mod wheel. You can add vibrato as you wish, but you will see that I have some tricks up my sleeve on this patch. So now we can have a look here at the mixer just to give you an overview. This patch contains the 3 oscillators at the same time, as well as ring modulation and noise. So let's get started by looking into what the oscillators are doing. Have a look here into the wave shape. On my research here, when I was looking on how to recreate a string sound, I always saw this squarish triangular wave that oscillates quite a lot while the sound is in its sustained phase. And the pattern gets more spread out when you are on the lower frequencies. And this was more or less a pattern that I found in many of the strings patches while looking into spectrometers and the wave shapes. But I must do a disclaimer that this patch is very specific to Hydrasynth, because if we look at the oscillator 1 here as our sound source, you can see that I'm using a very particular wave shape from the Hydrasynth library here called Melodic 1, and that is one of the many wavetable wave shapes that you can find in Hydra. If you try to reproduce this in other platforms, most likely a good starting point can be a sawtooth due to its harmonics. But what I'm doing here, I'm doing this movement between oscillator 1 and 2 by also detuning just 1 cent off in my oscillator 1, and oscillator 2 is in essence the same sound source but tune it 1 cent down. But there is a lot going on the modulation. You saw that this sound is very dynamic even in its sustained phase. And partially this is done by Mutant 1 here by using linear FM with a triangular wave as its source, and that's one of the factors that gives the wave shape all this triangular distortions there. And by changing or experimenting with the ratio here, I realized that if I slightly diminish the ratio below 1, I get that characteristic detuning of a violin interacting with its bow. And that's what gives this slight vibrato, even though I'm not using the modulation wheel characteristic or default vibrato from the Hydra. However, if we now look into oscillator 2, this one is purely the oscillator wave without any modulation. But while having only the two oscillators, what I realized is that I lost many harmonics by using such a sine wave-ish kind of wave shape. Therefore, I tried to give this sound a little bit more harmonics by introducing a sawtooth wave in oscillator number 3, again detuned 1 cent lower to help on the bass sounds for the lower octaves here. Another characteristic of the violin is the metallic sound or the metallic harmonics that are usually present with the interaction between the bow and the strings. And in order to try to achieve this, I've used or experimented with ring modulation here. And for my ring modulation, I've used oscillator 1 as source 1 and oscillator 2 being modulated by oscillator 1. Not much depth, just 6.8. And I'm using white noise to also try to mimic the interaction between the bow and the strings. And here you can see that I have ring modulation volume around 60 and my noise very low, just to give some texture to the sound. So here you can see side by side how I have mixed the different sound sources. Oscillator 1 with the highest volume in 117, oscillator 2 87.8, and oscillator 3 just to give me some low frequencies and harmonics with only 44.4. And as we saw in the ring modulation page, ring on 60 and noise on 14. Now let me show you my choices for filters here and how I have modulated both the amplifier and the filters. In this sound I actually used two types of filter, a low pass ladder filter of 12 dBs per octave, and this was because I gained a lot of high notes by introducing all the harmonics there on the sound sources. So when playing very high on the keyboard, I needed to filter out a little bit of all these high frequencies. I have used my cutoff value in 65.2, no resonance, with a slight modulation from the LFO, which contributes to all the movement you see in the waveform when I hold it in its sustained phase. But I'm also tracking the keys on the filter modulation, and I'm not only using filter 1, but I'm also using filter 2. And for this one I'm using the hybrid low pass, band pass, high pass, mostly to use it as a high pass filter, as you can see in the graph. And that's why my morph is at 128 to use only high pass with a cutoff frequency set to 68.9, almost 69 here. No resonance, no key track, no modulation. So I'm filtering this sound from both sides, because when looking into other string patches into the spectrometer, I realized that the majority of the frequencies lies on the high side of the spectrum, so very little low frequencies, and that's why we need to filter this sound from both sides, on the low pass here and the high pass there. The LFO1 that is linked to the filters is a very fast LFO set to a rate of 7 Hz and the level of 61, but this is just doing a slight modulation here on filter 1, as you can see in the LFO amount here, not more than this. And I'm not doing anything special in the filter envelopes here, it's just a trigger. However, for the amplifier, I'm making use a lot of the velocity envelope to try to make the patch more responsive, and also to allow you to hold a chord softly while soloing with the other hand. To give you some more room for dynamics there, with the amp level set to 98. But as you can imagine, part of the timbre of the violin is due to the fact that you don't have any attack or pluck to the strings, unless you're using a pluck technique, of course. But the bow gives this very slow attack to the sound. So you can see here my envelope shape with a significantly long attack of 300 milliseconds, sustain set to its maximum volume, volume and also a long release here of 120 mils. I also make a lot of use of the attack curve here on exponential -33. I'm not actually using decay, but if you look at the release curve, it's also almost the opposite, exponential +32 there. But these are not the only envelopes that I have used to modulate this sound. So to give you an overview of what I'm using in terms of LFOs and envelopes, let's jump into the mod matrix and let's try to explore a little bit from here, following the logics I have used to try to recreate the violin sound. So on page 1 here, I'm using LFO 5 to modulate the depth of my Mutant 1. So if you remember, Mutant 1 here was a linear modulation of a triangular wave with a lower ratio. But what I realized while playing with the knobs here and with the keys is that by varying the depth of the FM modulation for oscillator 1, I was getting a vibrato that is different from the modulation pitch, and it was very subtle, which for me was very similar to the interaction of a bow and a string of the violin. But to do this very rapidly, I made use of the last LFO here. So let's have a look at LFO 5. And again, the soft spot for me there was to use a sine wave at a rate of 6.34 Hertz and not a big level there. And this is what is modulating my Mutant 1 depth and giving the vibrato that you can hear a lot on the lower notes. Okay, back to the mod matrix here. We can also see another trick that I try to make this patch more interactive. When you look at a violin player, they tend to move their fingers a lot to give a vibrato to the sound. So what I'm trying to do here, I'm using Poly Aftertouch to change slightly the pitch of all oscillators at the same time to a higher pitch. And my idea was to try to mimic the gesture that the violin players do, and I realized that if I press and release the key, triggering the aftertouch, I also get that bending / vibrato effect. The faster you do this, the better you get the pitch modulation vibrato that you can add to your performance on top of the linear modulation done by LFO 5 here. So you can try that out if you reproduce this patch on your Hydra. Let me know if it worked good for you, and you can also spice it up to your way of playing and how sensitive you use the aftertouch. And to complement the modulation here, I'm using envelope 5 to alter the pitch downwards to all oscillators. So let's have a look at envelope 5 here. And as you can see, this is a very spiky curve for the envelope. It's just a fast attack and decay. And what I'm trying to reproduce here is the heat of the bow to the string that will do that drop in pitch, really fast one. So it's simply a fast 18 milliseconds attack and 96 milliseconds decay. And if we look at the second page here, I have an attack curve with exponential -52 and a decay curve of exponential +32. And then we can go back to the mod matrix. So I'm using Aftertouch to bend it up, pretty much like it would happen if you press the violin strings too strong, but using the envelope to do pitch modulation. If we now go to page 2 in our mod matrix, you'll see that I'm using the same LFO 5 that has that very fast rate of 6.34 Hertz to modulate also the amp level, because it is not only about changing the pitch of the strings when the bow is sliding through them, but it also creates dynamics in volume. And you can see here that I also routed in the position 5 of our matrix here the velocity on to the attack of envelope 2. And if you remember, envelope 2 is the one that is connected to the amp volume. So the fastest you play on the keys will also affect how fast your attack will be, because this is impacting the attack on a value of -28 here. So the faster I play, the faster my attack will be, pretty much like you would do if you strike the bow very rapidly onto the violin strings, right? And to make this movement even more difficult to, or not so obvious to perceive just with the rate of LFO5, I'm also making use of LFO4 here to modulate the rate of LFO5 slightly. So if we look at LFO4, this is a very slow down saw tooth of a rate of 0.18. And what I was trying to mimic here, if I come back to the LFO page, is the exact movement of the violin bow that will strike faster and then slow it by the end of the bow. So this was what I was trying to represent with a sawtooth down, that you start faster and then you slow it down. And that's the kind of dynamic that I'm trying to mimic here. If I go back to the mod matrix, while modulating LFO5 rate, the speed of LFO5, which is our pitch and volume modulation, towards this ramp representing the movement of the bow. Well, this is it about modulation, and what I added after this was a very basic reverb, almost following the default Hall the reverb from Hydra, but I actually had to slow down the pre-delay phase here because it was not articulating the notes well when doing arpeggios or exercises like this. But you can of course play around with a reverb. My reverb was also quite slow, 1.4 seconds. I haven't changed the tone of -50, and my dry and wet are around 40% here. Another detail that I forgot to mention, it's actually that I did some testing by using the ribbon menu, which is outside of my focus here, but you will find it around this region. And I set my ribbon to theremin mode without quantizing it, and it makes for me a lot of sense because the violin is also fretless. But I sound as bad playing the theremin as I do when playing the violin, because I'm not precise. But you get some interesting dynamics there if you practice, and for some sounds like the more Asian type of music, it makes a lot of sense to use these glides. I've tried out a little bit the glide menu, but without having very good results. And like I showed you, from this patch I could evolve more into the air who. Which uses the same principles but with other envelopes and modulations here to try to mimic more the bending effect of this instrument. I'm not so very happy about the result here, it's still work in progress, but I wanted to know from you guys if this basis of a patch is useful for you, and maybe get some ideas, tips and tricks from you guys to try and to evolve this into a more polished patch. But I'm pretty happy with the basis, with the result here. And let me know if you reproduce this patch into your Hydrasynth, what did you come up with? So maybe we can evolve this initial idea into a few other ones. As always, thanks for watching.